1 through 3. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who are enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh. Stir up your might and come to save us. Restore us, O God. Let your face shine, that we may be saved. Amen. Today's reading is from Matthew 1, verse 20 through 21. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived and bears from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Amen.
Wow, there's a lot going on this morning, isn't there? Isn't the music just amazing? And a visit from Joseph, which I'm so glad you set me really well up for this sermon. You know, the amazing thing about where we are in Advent is we are taking this really slow walk through the Gospel of Matthew. You know, normally when we hear the Christmas story in Advent season or around this time, we conflate all the stories together. We think of the angel choir singing, and we think of the angels appearing to shepherds and all that kind of stuff, but none of that part of the story is in the book of Matthew. Because as I mentioned last week, Matthew was written as a gospel that was trying to bring hope to a community that was struggling. You'll remember that I said that the community that the scholars believe that this gospel was written to, in other words, the person who was compiling all these stories and sayings of Jesus, was trying to make sense of the gospel story now several years, tens of years actually, maybe 40 years later after the resurrection of Jesus. Those first disciples were starting to die out that were eyewitnesses, and they wanted to capture the stories that made sense to them, that would bring them hope, that would be an encouragement to them. And this little city where this church was located is in Antioch, ancient Antioch. It's right on the very southern point of Turkey and on the northern border of Syria. It's a coastal city, which meant that people from that city oftentimes went out throughout the whole Roman Empire in their day, bringing goods in, ideas flowing in, goods and ideas flowing out. But as I mentioned last week, it was a church that was also struggling with its identity. First formed as a Jewish community within a local synagogue, made up of believers who had been present at Pentecost, 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus. They had heard about the powerful word from the disciples in that day, where they proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus. There was this sense of incredible community that poured over the city of Jerusalem. And they, though, had to go home after the festival, and when they returned, they founded this little community. But the community, while it was vibrant in the beginning, while it sent out missionaries like Paul and Barnabas initially from its ranks, where it began to see the gospel taking hold not only in the Jewish community, but also among non-believing Jews, among Gentiles in their area, it was just this heady, wild place. But then, as often happens in churches, and we all know what happens, right? Human beings get involved. And things went a little south. Barnabas and Paul, who had made up this great missionary team, they got into such a fight that they never spoke again. The community itself got into some tangles with the synagogue. They weren't really sure what to do with them. And they got kind of kicked out of that community. And then at the time when this gospel was captured, Rome doesn't fall, the city of Jerusalem falls. By Rome just flattens the city. So their Jewish identity is sort of wiped out. But then at the same time, there becomes these periodic or sporadic pockets of persecution throughout the Roman Empire for people who identify themselves as Christians. And they needed a word of hope. They needed to know if God was really going to be there for them. And last week, as we looked at this story, you'll remember that we were following just those first few verses about Mary, where it says she was found to be pregnant. And that in her circumstances, from her perspective, the options were horrible. She would be accused, most likely, of adultery because the child was not from Joseph, who she was engaged to. There was no cover story for her. There was no narrative that would make this all okay. And her only options were to be stoned to death as an adulteress or to be quietly banished from her community. And we left the story last week with Joseph contemplating that second option, quietly divorcing Mary, which would have meant her banishment. But for Mary, that would have been a thread of hope, a thread of the possibility of life, the thread that possibly this dream, this angel visitation, or however she understood it, could come to happen, that her child would somehow survive. Because as she understood it, she was impregnated, and the child within her was holy, to be set apart for some design she didn't even know, according to Matthew. But it was her job to see a way through for that child to be born. Well, when we left the story last week, it seemed like everything hinged on what Joseph was about to do. And of course, we kind of know what ends up happening in the story. But I want us to go back and really try to see this story from Joseph's point of view. What was the culture that Joseph would have found himself wrestling with in this season of his life? Well, first of all, I think you need to understand what life would have been like for a young Jewish man in first century Palestine, in the Galilee region. You see, Joseph, and even the people that this letter was written to, this gospel was written for, was captured for, all understood this wonderful Jewish concept of dor lador. What that means in Hebrew is from one generation to the next. And Joseph was part of a legacy where the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers taught their sons all the way down a line about their traditions and the wisdom of the Jewish faith. We actually get sort of a hint of it. It's kind of lost on us Western eyes, perhaps, why Matthew starts with this incredible genealogy, where all the names after a while just are names that don't mean a lot to you or to me, perhaps, unless you're a biblical scholar. But what Matthew is doing here is identifying that Jesus comes from a long line of generation after generation after generation of faithful people. And it would have been the responsibility of Joseph's father to have taught him that wisdom. And the number one thing that Joseph would have learned from his father was how to relate to God. You see, the fathers in those societies really were the ones who were the first teachers to their children. And before Joseph would have started any kind of public education, and I say that in quotes, any kind of education in the local synagogue, it would have been his father who would have schooled him on his letters. Any kind of basic literacy that he would have come by would have come from his father. And in fact, the literacy that he was taught and the things he was expected to read and know were the ancient scriptures and the law. Joseph, from maybe the time he was 3 or 4, according to the traditions, would have been memorizing scripture. And then somehow as a young lad, maybe 5, 6, 7, would have started some sort of synagogue training. He would have been well prepared for his father to enter into that kind of education, passing the law down one generation to the next. Joseph would have learned from his father that the most important thing in his life was to learn to love God, to know who God was, to love God with his whole heart, mind, and soul. This would have been embedded into Joseph as the most important thing he could know and believe and act out as a young boy who was growing and becoming a man. But also in that, he would have also known that not only was he expected to live wholeheartedly in this life towards God, but obedience and faithfulness to this God was important. He would have been schooled in the laws of the day, and he would have known that to remain a faithful person to this God who is the creator of the universe meant that step by step his life was ordered by the Jewish law. And it says in the scriptures that Joseph indeed was an obedient and upright Jew. We have every reason to believe that this tradition of dor lador, from generation to generation, was something he would have received and benefited from. But as important as it was for Joseph to understand his relationship to God, his father also would have schooled him in another Jewish concept, and it's called beshert. Beshert is what is called the family, understanding of family in a Jewish sense. You see, Joseph would have been taught and modeled as a young boy what it meant to put family first. In this culture, wealth was not the thing that you strive for. It was a family. You see, Joseph would have known that all his life that the thing he would have looked forward to was having children of his own, having a son that he would pass on the wisdom of the generation. In this concept of Beshert is this idea of reverence, not only for God, but for one another in the family. And Joseph would have learned from his father and modeled in their own home how important it would have been for the family, for the father, to set the tone for what happened inside that home. So much so that the rabbis in that day said, if you were to demonstrate that you love your neighbor, it must start with how kindly you treat your wife. You see, this respect and revering of family members was so important within the home. And Joseph's father would have passed that along to him as well. It must have been so thrilling for Joseph when he got engaged. There were no bachelors in Galilee in that day. The thing you strove to be was a father, to be a husband. You were socialized to this, you'd been preparing for all of this, and with the wisdom of his parents, in what was surely an arranged marriage, he would have completely trusted his father to have made a good choice for him in a wife. And that wife, who would it have been? From the family and the village perspective, the villages usually only had 2 or 3 families within them. Usually the family connections in marriage were often between cousins, second cousins, third cousins, but often part of the same family system, because the girls would have been known within that family. Their reputations would have been known. Their parents would have been known. You see, if you're going to form Beshert, this family system that centers around God and around the household, you need to be sure that the spouse that is being chosen has the potential to be a soulmate for your son. And while we might think of Mary and Joseph in this sort of romantic way, as we do, we sort of read our 21st century ideals of marriage onto it, in that day and age, marriage was really far more like a contract or a covenant. It was a commitment. This soulmate idea and this idea of love really was born out of this sense of partnership, out of respect. Now, that didn't mean that the Jews in that day didn't celebrate passion and love just like we do. But it wasn't the most important thing. It was this commitment and this covenant to one another that each person in the family would need to thrive for in order for their children to grow up and then learn the traditions and the love of God. It was only possible if there was the love of the parents that set the foundation. So Joseph was thrilled to be engaged. I'm sure he asked his father about all sorts of advice of what it meant to be a good father and a husband as the days were getting closer. I'm sure he asked his mother about what it would be like to bring Mary into their home, and there were probably lots of discussions about how they would make that all work. For the unity of the home was so important to them in that day. It's interesting because you can just imagine the joy that must have happened when Mary and Joseph, as they were sort of getting to know each other in this whole season, there would be village community events, there would be family events, and you can imagine the couple finding time to speak to one another. Well chaperoned, of course, but a chance for them to get to know each other and to be sort of testing one another out in this new relationship. Of course, it's likely that they had already known each other, but they had not been contractually committed to each other in this way towards marriage. It changed everything. So you can only imagine how disruptive it was, as Sean showed us this morning, for Joseph when Mary is pregnant. You see, and as I mentioned last week, in an honor-shame society, it would have brought tremendous shame on Mary, but it would have also reflected poorly on Joseph and his family. You see, the first assumption would have been that Joseph got Mary pregnant. And can you imagine the anger in his household? The words that were probably spoken by his father as he was confronted. Joseph, how could you do this? You've brought shame. Couldn't you have waited until the marriage? The logical assumption, of course, being that he's the father. Can you imagine what his mother had to say to him? The anger that would have been in the household. And then when Joseph begins to protest his innocence, can you imagine how the anger then shifts to Mary? This is a scandal beyond all proportion. They would have no more wanted that woman in their household. it would have tainted them. It would have poisoned them. It would have interrupted. There's no door la door now if this is not even Joseph's biological son. How can you create Besher, this idea of family, of mutual respect, if Mary has so violated the cultural code? And for his parents and for Joseph, this was troubling. But the other thing that we may want to consider is that when Joseph makes his decision to send Mary away quietly, it may have been because Mary's family was part of their family. It wasn't just about saving Mary's honor or Joseph's honor or his parents' honor. It may have been the honor of the entire family, including Mary's family, and even perhaps the honor of the village. It must have been a really troubling set of nights for Joseph as he had sought the advice and input from his parents, maybe from other village elders, and he has this wild, unsettling dream where a messenger of God comes to him and says the one thing that is just unthinkable. First of all, says, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. For that good, Jewish, obedient man, he knew that he was required by law to divorce her. Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. The first disconnect is, how can I be obedient to the law and follow the messenger of God in this action? And yet, we know that he does. But even more so, he learns in this dream that this child that she's carrying is a boy. A boy. What was Joseph supposed to do with a boy? Was he expected now to pass on the great legacy of being a son of Abraham and a son of David, all the wisdom that came down to a child that wasn't even his? What was he supposed to do with a boy? How would he teach this child about Besher, the idea of family? A family that's based on covenant, faithfulness, respect. When this boy had been born out of what he only could have understood as a completely disobedient and disrespectful action of Mary. And no matter what an angel has to say to you, those seeds of doubt are there, and all of us know that in one moment you can be sure of what God's will is, and in another be in complete doubt about what you're supposed to do. Surely Joseph waffled and wondered how he could possibly enter into this relationship with Mary and then be responsible for this boy. Could he ever really, truly call him his son? And then even more troubling, the angel says to call him Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. This obedient, upright Jew who is being asked to twist his understanding of the law to marry this woman, to then make claim to a boy that is not his own as his son, is now being told that from his perspective, this child that was born in sin, this child who would mark his family with shame the rest of his life, was somehow this child of sin was going to be the savior of the world. I can almost hear Joseph laughing hysterically, can't you? At how outrageous this is. I mean, really. First of all, angels, really? Then you're going to ask me to marry this woman. You're going to ask me to claim this child. You're going to ask me to take responsibility. And you know that the rumors will dog me and him the rest of our lives. And yet, he's going to be the Messiah? Holy goodness, God, what were you thinking? How were you thinking? Why are you thinking this way? But you know the most astonishing thing? Joseph did convey the legacy of the tradition of the wisdom to that little boy Jesus. For we see Jesus in his power to be able to teach and interpret the law. Jesus is the one who by the influence, certainly, of Joseph, learns to love God with his whole heart, mind, and soul, and inspires not only the generation then, but generations afterwards. We are the door. We have received the wisdom that Joseph passed to Jesus that has been passed on to us. And Joseph must have taught Jesus about the value of love, the value of respect, the value of family, and certainly most of all, the importance of inclusion. That everyone created in God's image is worthy of God's love. And for that community back in ancient Antioch, who was struggling to see with hope what God was doing, that sliver of hope that they may have seen in Mary's story now got wider as they saw that the faithfulness of Joseph could produce a harvest unknown to anything. Like Joseph, they were called to stand firm and trust a God who always saves. Amen.